What if I told you the hardest part of growing old isn't pain, isn't sickness, but the moment I started feeling invisible? I'm 82 years old, and I live alone in Seattle. After my wife Mary passed away, my world slowly became quiet, too quiet. The same house that once felt warm, full of laughter and life, turned into a place filled with silence. Every corner reminded me of what I had lost. My daughter Edley lives in Portland. She calls me every day, always the same questions. Dad, did you eat? Did you take your medicine? Or are you okay? I am 82 years old, and the silence in my home has grown heavier with each passing day. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when this house felt alive, filled with small conversations, shared laughter, and the comforting presence of someone who understood me without words. That presence was Mary, my wife, my companion for decades, but after she passed away everything changed. The same walls, the same furniture, the same rooms, they are all still here, yet nothing feels the same anymore. Mornings have become the hardest. I wake up and, for a brief second, I forget that she's gone. In that quiet space between sleep and reality, I still expect to hear her voice, to see her in the kitchen, making coffee just the way I like it. But then the silence returns, sharp and undeniable. The realization hits me every day, like a wave I can never prepare for. I sit on the edge of my bed, staring at the empty side where Mary used to sleep, as if somehow things might go back to the way they were. Simple routines have turned into painful reminders. Sometimes I still make 2 cups of coffee out of habit, and then I stop, just staring at the second cup. Meals are shorter now, quieter. There's no one to ask me how my day was, no one to share small stories with. Even the television, which once filled the room with background noise, now feels too loud and too empty at the same time. Most days, I just turn it off and sit in silence. The house itself feels different. It's not just empty, it feels distant, unfamiliar in a strange way. Every corner holds a memory. The chair where Mary used to sit and read, the kitchen where she spent hours cooking, the window where we stood together watching the rain. These memories don't comfort me anymore. They make the silence louder. Sometimes I walk from one room to another, without any real reason, just to feel like I'm still moving, still doing something. Nights are even worse. The quiet becomes deeper, almost overwhelming. Without Mary beside me, sleep doesn't come easily. I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside, wondering how everything changed so much. Time feels slower, heavier, as if each hour stretches longer than it should. I try to stay strong. I tell myself this is part of life, that everyone goes through loss at some point. But knowing that doesn't make it easier. The truth is, I don't just miss Mary. I miss the life we built together. Without her, the days feel longer, the nights colder, and the world a little less meaningful. And slowly, without even realizing it, the silence has started to take over not just my home, but my entire life. My daughter Emily has always been close to me, but after Mary passed away, that connection changed in a deeper way. She lives in Portland with her family, a life full of responsibilities, work, and routines that never seem to slow down. Still, no matter how busy she gets, she calls me every single day. At first those calls felt natural, even comforting. She would ask how I was doing, what I had eaten, whether I had gone out for a walk, and I would always answer the same way, calmly, simply telling her I was fine, that there was nothing to worry about. But over time, she started noticing things, small things I didn't even realize myself. Sometimes I would pause in the middle of a sentence, trying to remember what I was saying. Sometimes I repeated the same thing without noticing. Other times, I just felt tired. Even talking felt like more effort than it used to be. I tried to hide it to sound normal, but a daughter always knows, and Emily, she started to worry. One evening, during one of our usual calls, she asked me what I had for dinner. I don't know why, but I hesitated for a moment before answering. Maybe because I hadn't really eaten properly. Maybe because I didn't want her to worry. But that one small pause, she noticed it. I gave her a simple answer, something quick, but even I knew it didn't sound convincing. After that, her questions changed. They became more frequent, more careful, more concerned. Did you take your medicine? Did you lock the door? Did you turn off the stove? Sometimes I would laugh it off, telling her she worries too much, and it's true she does. But I also know where it comes from. It comes from love. Still, I could feel something slowly changing between us. For her, these questions were necessary. For me, they felt like small reminders that maybe she didn't see me the same way anymore. Like I wasn't as capable as I used to be. There were times she wanted to visit more often. I could hear it in her voice. But life doesn't stop for anyone. She has her children, her job, her responsibilities. And I understand that. I've lived that life myself. But I could also feel her helplessness growing, because no matter how many times she called, she couldn't really see how I was living. She couldn't be there if something went wrong. One morning, she called again. At first it was the same as always. The same questions, the same answers. But then there was a pause, a different kind of silence, heavier than usual. I could feel something coming. Her voice changed slightly softer, but stronger at the same time, like she had made up her mind about something. "Dad, you can't keep living like this," she said. I didn't say anything. "It's not safe anymore. You need to make a decision." I held the phone in my hand and slowly looked around my home. The same quiet walls, the same empty rooms, the same life I had been holding on to. For her, it was fear. For me, it was the moment I realized that maybe things were no longer the way I wanted to believe they were. I stayed quiet for a few seconds after Emily's words, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of thoughts you don't know how to say out loud. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Seattle, staring at the same cup of coffee I had made earlier, now gone cold. Her sentence kept echoing in my mind. "You can't keep living like this." It wasn't said with anger. It wasn't even harsh, but it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I slowly leaned back in my chair, looking around the kitchen. The small crack on the wall near the window, the cabinet door that never closed properly, the chair across from me that no one had used in a long time. Everything in that space was familiar, almost like a part of me. And yet, for the first time, I wondered if this place, my place, was now being seen as a problem. "Make a decision," she had said. But what decision? To leave the home I had lived in for years, to give up the routine I had built piece by piece after Mary was gone, to accept that I might not be able to live alone anymore. I felt something shift inside me, not anger exactly, but resistance. A quiet, stubborn feeling that told me, I wasn't ready to give up control over my own life. I had managed so far. Yes, there had been small mistakes, moments of forgetfulness, things I didn't like to think about too much. But did that mean I couldn't continue? At the same time, a part of me understood Emily's fear. I knew she wasn't trying to control me. She was scared. Scared of something happening when no one was there. Scared of getting a call one day that would change everything. I could hear it in her voice, the tension she tried to hide behind calm words. I sighed quietly and rubbed my hands together, as if trying to warm them. The truth was, her words had touched something deeper than I expected. Not just the question of safety, but something else, something harder to admit, the idea that I might be losing my independence. Slowly, without even noticing it, I picked up the phone again, still on the call, and held it closer to my ear. "What kind of decision?" I asked, my voice calm but heavy. Emily didn't answer immediately. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if she knew this moment more than any of our previous conversations. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, but clearer than ever. "We need to think about what's best for you," she said. "Not just now, but for the future." Future. That word stayed with me. For a long time, I hadn't thought much about the future. My days had become about getting through one at a time. Morning coffee, a short walk, a simple meal, a quiet evening. But now, suddenly, I was being asked to look ahead, to imagine my life that might be very different from the one I was holding on to. I turned my head slightly and looked out the window. The street below was calm, a few people passing by, cars moving at a steady pace. Life was going on just like always, and yet inside that small kitchen, everything felt like it was about to change. Emily took a slow breath before continuing, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time. I could hear the hesitation in her voice, but also a quiet determination. She wasn't going to avoid the conversation anymore. "There are a few options," she said gently. "We just need to find what works best for you." I didn't respond right away. I stayed still, holding the phone, listening carefully. Something about the way she said it made me realize that this wasn't just a suggestion anymore. It was a plan already forming in her mind. "The first option," Emily continued, "you could come live with us for a while, just to see how it feels." I closed my eyes for a moment. I could already imagine it. Different walls, different routines, a house that wasn't mine. I knew she meant well, but the thought of leaving everything felt heavier than I expected. "Still," I said nothing. "The second option," she went on, "we could find someone to come help you at home. Just a few hours a day. Cooking, cleaning, making sure everything is okay." I shifted slightly in my chair. The idea sounded reasonable, practical even. But at the same time, something about it made me uncomfortable. Having a stranger in my space, touching my things, adjusting my routine, it didn't sit right with me. There was a brief pause before she spoke again, and this time her voice was quieter. "And the third option, we could look at some retirement homes, just to explore it. No pressure." The word itself hung in the air. Retirement home. My grip on the phone tightened slightly. I had heard about places like that, had known people who ended up there. Clean, organized, safe, and yet, the thought of it made something inside me resist immediately. It felt too final, too distant from the life I still felt connected to. I slowly stood up from my chair and began walking toward the living room, the phone still pressed against my ear. Every step felt heavier, as if each option carried its own weight. I sat down on my old couch, the same one I had shared with Mary for years, and looked around the room. Each object held a memory: the lamp in the corner, the bookshelf, the small table near the window. This wasn't just a place to live. It was my life, in physical form. "You don't have to decide right now," Emily added quickly, sensing my silence. "We can take our time. Just think about it." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. But inside, my thoughts were far from calm. It wasn't just about choosing between three options. It felt like choosing between different versions of myself. In one, I was a guest in someone else's life. In another, I was someone who needed assistance. And in the last, I was someone who had given up my independence completely. None of them felt like me. I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling, letting her words settle in. The conversation had ended, but the decision had only just begun, and for the first time, I realized that this wasn't going to be a simple choice. It was going to change everything I thought I still had control over. A few days later, I packed a small brown suitcase and left my apartment in Seattle to stay with Emily in Portland. The drive felt longer than usual, even though I had made that trip many times before. This time, it wasn't a visit. It felt like something more uncertain, something I couldn't quite name. When I arrived, Emily welcomed me warmly, smiling in a way that showed both relief and concern. She had prepared the guest room for me: fresh sheets, neatly arranged furniture, even a small lamp on the bedside table. "Make yourself at home," she said. I smiled back, but something about that sentence didn't sit right with me. This wasn't my home. It was a place I was being welcomed into, a place where everything already had its own rhythm before I arrived. The first few days went smoothly. Emily made sure I was comfortable. We had meals together, watched television in the evenings, and talked about small things, memories, daily routines, even the grandchildren's lives. There was warmth in those moments, a sense of connection that I hadn't felt in a while. For a brief time, the loneliness seemed to fade, but slowly, almost quietly, things began to shift. Mornings started early in that house. Emily and her husband moved quickly, getting ready for work, preparing breakfast, organizing their day. The grandchildren rushed through the kitchen, grabbing things on their way out, their conversations fast and full of energy. I would sit at the table, watching it all happen around me, feeling like I was part of the scene, but not truly inside it. I wasn't used to this pace. Back in my own home, mornings were slow. I took my time with coffee, with reading, with simply being. Here, everything moved on a schedule I didn't control. During the day, the house became quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet I knew. It wasn't my silence. It belonged to someone else's space. I didn't know where things were kept, didn't feel comfortable moving around freely. Even simple actions, like opening a cabinet or turning on the television, made me hesitate for a second. In the evenings, when everyone returned, the house filled with life again, but not the kind I could easily join. Conversations were about work, school, plans I wasn't part of, people I didn't know. I listened, nodded, sometimes smiled, but inside I felt distant. It wasn't that anyone ignored me. They cared, they included me. But the connection didn't feel natural. One evening, Emily's husband asked me kindly, "Do you need anything from the store?" The tone was polite, respectful, but it carried something else. An assumption that I couldn't handle things on my own. It was a small moment, almost insignificant, but it stayed with me. That was when I truly felt it. I wasn't just visiting. I was depending, and that realization made something inside me uncomfortable. Not because I didn't appreciate the care, but because it slowly changed how I saw myself. In my own home, I was still me, independent, in control, living life on my terms. Here, I was someone being looked after, someone who needed help, someone who didn't quite fit into the life around me, even though I was loved. After returning to my apartment in Seattle, I felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort. The moment I opened the door, a familiar stillness welcomed me. The air felt slightly stale, the silence deeper than I remembered. But it was mine. I walked slowly through the living room, touching the back of a chair, adjusting a cushion, as if reconnecting with a place that still belonged to me. For a brief moment, I felt at ease again, but that feeling didn't last long. A few days later, Emily arranged for a helper to come by several times a week. I had agreed, though not without hesitation. I told myself it was just for practical things, cleaning groceries, small tasks. Nothing too personal, nothing that would change my life too much. The first day the helper arrived, she was polite and professional. She greeted me with a smile, introduced herself, and immediately began looking around the apartment, taking note of what needed to be done. I followed her from room to room, explaining where things were, how I liked certain things kept, which cabinet held what. She nodded, listening carefully, even writing things down in a small notebook. At first it felt manageable, but by the second visit, something had already started to feel different. She moved efficiently, cleaning, organizing, rearranging. The apartment began to look neater, more structured, but also unfamiliar. Items that I had kept in specific places for years were now moved to better spots. The remote control wasn't between the couch cushions anymore. My reading glasses weren't where I instinctively reached for them. Even the kitchen felt slightly off, as if someone had quietly reshaped it without asking. I didn't complain. I knew she was doing her job well. In fact, she was doing exactly what she was supposed to do. And yet, every time, I tried to find something and couldn't. A small frustration built inside me. It wasn't just about objects. It was about control. The more she helped, the more I felt like my space was no longer entirely mine. I began to hesitate before moving around freely, especially when she was there. If I walked into the kitchen while she was cleaning, I found myself stepping back, almost apologizing, as if I were interrupting her work in my own home. That feeling unsettled me. There were also moments of quiet observation. She would remind me about my medicine, ask if I had eaten, suggest small changes to make things easier. Her tone was kind, but it carried a subtle shift in roles. She was managing, and I was being managed. One afternoon, after she left, I sat alone in the living room, looking around. Everything was cleaner, more organized, yet something felt missing. The comfort I once felt in my own space had faded slightly, replaced by a sense of distance I couldn't fully explain. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. This was my home, but it no longer felt completely like mine. and that realization stayed with me longer than I expected, quietly growing stronger each time the door opened and someone else stepped in to take control of the life I had once handled on my own. A few weeks later, Emily suggested we visit a retirement home in Seattle. She spoke about it gently, carefully choosing her words as if trying not to push too hard. I didn't argue this time. Maybe I was tired of resisting, or maybe a part of me wanted to see for myself what it was really like. So one quiet morning, we drove together to a modern facility not too far from my neighborhood. From the outside, it looked peaceful. Clean pathways, trimmed gardens, large windows letting in natural light. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm. As we walked inside, we were greeted by a smiling staff member who welcomed us warmly and offered to give us a tour. The halls were bright, the floors spotless, and there was a soft scent of cleaning products mixed with something faintly floral. I nodded politely as we moved from one room to another. The staff explained everything in detail: meal times, activities, medical support, safety measures. There was a schedule for everything. Breakfast at a fixed hour, lunch at another, group activities in the afternoon, quiet time in the evening. It was organized, efficient, predictable. And that was exactly what made me uneasy. We passed a common room where several elderly residents were sitting in armchairs, facing a large television. Some were watching, others simply staring ahead, lost in their own thoughts. A few smiled faintly as I walked by, but most of them looked distant, as if they were present in body, but somewhere else in spirit. I slowed my steps. Something about that room stayed with me. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something quieter, heavier. A kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace, but like waiting. Waiting for the next activity, the next meal, the next day. Waiting without urgency, without purpose. As we continued the tour, Emily asked questions, trying to understand how everything worked. She seemed reassured by the answers, by the professionalism, by the safety the place offered. And I understood that. I knew this place was designed to protect people like me, to make life easier, more controlled. But as I listened, I couldn't ignore the feeling growing inside me. This place wasn't about living. It was about managing life. I stepped into one of the private rooms they showed me. It was clean, simple, well-maintained. A bed, a small table, a chair by the window. It had everything a person might need. And yet, standing there, I felt a strange emptiness. There were no memories in that room, no history, no sense of belonging. I imagined myself sitting there day after day, following the same routine, surrounded by strangers, living a life that no longer felt like my own. The thought settled heavily in my chest. When we finally stepped back outside, the fresh air felt different. I took a deep breath, looking around at the open space, the sky above, the small details of the world moving freely, cars passing, people walking, distant sounds of the city continuing as always. Life was still out there, moving, unpredictable, real. I glanced at Emily, who was watching me carefully, waiting for my reaction. I gave a small nod, not wanting to upset her, but inside, my decision was already forming, not as words, but as a quiet certainty I couldn't ignore. Back in Seattle, I found myself returning to the places that had always made me connected to the world around me. The city was no longer just where I lived. It was part of who I was. Every street, every corner, every familiar view carried something personal, something that reminded me I still belonged somewhere. One afternoon, I made my way to Cary Park. It wasn't a long walk, but I took my time, stopping occasionally, catching my breath, noticing small details I used to overlook. When I reached the top, I stood still for a moment, looking out at the view. The skyline stretched in front of me, the Space Needle rising proudly, and in the distance, the mountains stood quietly beneath the sky. It looked like a postcard, something almost unreal in its beauty. I had been there many times before, often with Mary. We would stand side by side, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching in silence. Now, standing there alone, the memory felt close but not painful. It was different from the silence in my apartment. Here, the quiet felt open, not heavy. It allowed me to breathe. On another day, I walked through Pike Place Market. The moment I stepped inside, everything changed. The sound of people talking, vendors calling out, the laughter, the movement. It was alive. I slowed down, taking in the colors of fresh flowers, the smell of baked goods, the salty air coming from the water nearby. It reminded me that life was still moving, still full of energy, even if my own days had become quieter. Sometimes I didn't buy anything. I would just walk through, observing, feeling the presence of others around me. That was enough. Then there were the days when I needed something calmer. On those days, I went to Discovery Park. The trails there were quiet, surrounded by trees and open spaces that stretched toward the water. I would walk slowly, listening to the sound of the wind, the distant waves, the soft crunch of gravel under my feet. There was something grounding about that place, something that made my thoughts settle. I often found myself pausing along the path, looking out at the horizon. In those moments, I didn't feel like an old man trying to figure out what to do next. I felt like myself, just me, someone who had lived, loved, lost, and was still here. The city gave me something none of the other options could. It didn't treat me like a problem to be solved. It didn't organize my life into schedules or routines. It simply existed, open and unpredictable, allowing me to be part of it in my own way. And in those walks, those quiet moments between crowded streets and empty trails, I began to realize that maybe what I needed wasn't to leave my life behind, but to reconnect with it in a different way. One morning, as I was heading out to buy bread from a small shop down the street in Seattle, I noticed something unusual near the entrance of my building. My neighbor Mark was standing there, looking overwhelmed. One child was crying loudly in a stroller, while the other clung to his jacket, pulling at him with restless energy. Mark looked tired, confused, as if he didn't know which problem to solve first. I slowed my steps and watched for a moment. It wasn't curiosity, it was instinct. I had seen that kind of situation before, many years ago, when life was louder, busier, and full of small responsibilities that came without instructions. Without thinking too much, I stepped closer. "Do you need a hand?" I asked calmly. Mark looked at me, surprised, almost unsure how to respond. For a second, he hesitated, probably weighing whether it was okay to accept help from someone he barely knew, but the exhaustion on his face spoke louder than any hesitation. "Actually, yes," he admitted, letting out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. I nodded gently, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Let me take the older one upstairs for a bit. You handle the little one." Mark blinked, still slightly unsure, but then gave a small nod. There was trust in that moment, quiet and unspoken. The boy's name was Ethan. He looked up at me with curious eyes, unsure but not afraid. I smiled and held out my hand. "Come on, let's go watch something." We walked upstairs together, slowly, step by step. Inside the apartment, I turned on the television and found a cartoon channel. I offered the boy some biscuits and juice, simple things, the kind that didn't need explanation. Ethan settled onto the couch, his attention quickly shifting to the screen. For a while, there was no noise except the soft sounds of the cartoon. I sat beside him, watching quietly. But instead of focusing on the television, I found myself watching the boy. The way he laughed suddenly, the way his face lit up at the smallest things. It had been a long time since there had been that kind of energy in my home. Something inside me shifted. The silence that had once felt heavy now felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. Time passed without me noticing. When Mark knocked on the door, later he seemed relieved, almost grateful beyond words. He thanked me again and again, slightly embarrassed but sincere. I waved it off with a small smile. "It's nothing," I said. But I knew it wasn't nothing. After they left, I remained seated on the couch for a while. The room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet. There was a warmth lingering in the space, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. I leaned back slowly, looking around the room. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone in that space. Not because someone was there, but because, for a moment, I had been part of something again. After that morning, something subtle but meaningful began to change in my daily life in Seattle. It didn't happen all at once. There was no big decision, no dramatic shift. Just small moments, one after another, quietly reshaping the way my days felt. A couple of days later, Mark knocked on my door again. This time, he didn't look as overwhelmed, but there was still a hint of hesitation in his expression. "Do you think you could watch Ethan for a little while?" he asked. "Just an hour." I didn't think twice. "Of course," I replied, and just like that, it became something regular. Ethan started coming over more often. Sometimes it was for an hour, sometimes longer. I would put on cartoons, bring out snacks, and sit beside him on the couch. But it wasn't just about keeping a child occupied. It was about the presence, the small conversations, the laughter that filled the room again. The apartment no longer felt like a place frozen in time. It began to feel alive. Soon, other small connections started to form. One afternoon, as I was heading back from the store, I noticed an elderly woman from the 4th floor, struggling with her grocery bags near the entrance. Without hesitation, I walked over and offered to help. She smiled with relief, and together we carried the bags upstairs. It wasn't a big task, but it felt meaningful. Another day, a young woman from the 3rd floor asked if I could receive a package for her while she was at work. I agreed. When she came later in the evening to pick it up, she stayed for a few minutes, thanking me and asking how I was doing. It was a simple interaction, but it lingered in a way that mattered. Gradually, these small exchanges became part of my routine. I wasn't planning them. They just happened. And with each passing day, I began to notice something important. People started to rely on me, not in a heavy or overwhelming way, but in small, everyday ways. Someone would ask for a favor. Someone would stop for a quick chat. Someone would check in on me just to say hello. In return, I found myself receiving things I hadn't expected. a bag of groceries left at my door, a warm meal brought over without warning, a neighbor fixing something that'd been broken for months. These gestures weren't organized or scheduled. They were natural, spontaneous, human. One evening, as I sat by the window, I reflected on how different everything felt. Not long ago, my days were filled with silence and uncertainty. Now, there was movement, connection, a sense that I was part of something again. I realized that this wasn't about being taken care of. It was about being involved. I wasn't just passing time anymore. I was contributing, even in small ways. And those small ways added up, giving my days a kind of purpose I thought I had lost. The feeling surprised me, not because it was new, but because it reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that even now, even at this stage of life, I still had something to give. As the days passed, I began to notice a quiet but powerful shift inside myself. It wasn't something dramatic or sudden, but a gradual change in how I saw my place in the world. Not long ago, I had started to believe that I was becoming a burden, someone others had to worry about, manage and protect. That feeling had followed me everywhere, whether I was at my daughter's house, alone in my apartment, or even considering a retirement home. But now things felt different. It started with small realizations. When Ethan knocked on my door with a smile, excited to spend time with me, I didn't feel like someone being taken care of. I felt needed. When Mark asked for help, it wasn't out of obligation. It was trust, and that trust meant something more than words could explain. One afternoon, while sitting by the window in my apartment in Seattle, I watched people walking by on the street below. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel separate from them. I didn't feel like someone standing outside of life, just observing it. Instead, I felt connected, as if I was still part of the same rhythm, just in a different way. I thought back to those 3 options Emily had given me: living with family, hiring help, or moving into a retirement home. At the time, all of them had made me feel like I was losing something: my independence, my identity, my sense of self. They were solutions, yes, but they were also limitations. Now, I understood why none of them had felt right. It wasn't because they were wrong. It was because they didn't give me what I truly needed. I didn't just need safety or comfort. I needed purpose. Without it, even the safest, most comfortable place would feel empty. And with it, even the simplest life could feel full. That realization changed everything. I no longer saw myself as someone waiting for help. Instead, I saw myself as someone who could still offer something, no matter how small. Carrying groceries, watching a child, having a conversation. These weren't just tasks. They were connections. They were proof that I still mattered. One evening, Mark stopped by with a cup of coffee, and we sat together talking about nothing in particular. It was a simple moment, but as I listened, I felt a quiet sense of belonging. Not forced, not arranged, just natural. And that's when it became clear to me. I wasn't a burden. I had only felt like one because I was placed in situations where I couldn't contribute, where I was expected to only receive. But here, in my own environment, surrounded by everyday life, I had found a balance again. I could give, and because I could give, I could receive without feeling small. That balance restored something deep inside me, something that had been fading without me even realizing it, a sense of dignity, a sense of identity, a sense that I was still me, Not just someone defined by age or limitations, but someone who still had a role to play in the lives around me. I didn't make a loud announcement or a dramatic decision about my life. There was no single moment where everything changed all at once. Instead, it happened quietly, over time, through small choices and simple realizations that slowly became part of who I was. I stayed in my apartment in Seattle, surrounded by the life I knew, but now living it in a different way. I still had difficult days. There were mornings when my body felt heavier than usual, when getting out of bed took more effort than I wanted to admit. There were moments when the silence returned, reminding me of Mary and the life we once shared. Some evenings felt longer than others, especially when the city outside seemed distant and quiet. But those moments no longer defined my entire life, because now there were other moments too. There were mornings when Ethan waited for me downstairs, with a drawing in his hand, eager to show me something new. The drawings were simple, sometimes messy, but full of life. I would look at them carefully, asking questions, listening to his excited explanations, feeling a kind of joy that didn't need to be explained. There were afternoons when Mark would stop by for a quick chat, sometimes bringing coffee, sometimes just a few minutes of conversation. We talked about ordinary things, weather, daily routines, small worries, but those conversations carried a quiet comfort. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, not in the way I once felt. There were small acts of connection scattered throughout my days. A neighbor greeting me by name, someone asking for a favor, someone offering help without being asked. These weren't big events, but they added up, creating a sense of belonging that I had almost lost. I began to understand something that I hadn't fully seen before. Life didn't end when things changed. It simply became something else. Growing older didn't mean disappearing from the world. It didn't mean becoming invisible or irrelevant. It meant adjusting, finding new ways to exist, new ways to connect, new ways to matter. I thought about all the fear I had felt before, the fear of becoming a burden, of being placed somewhere where I no longer had a role, of losing the life I recognized. Those fears were real, but they had also been incomplete. They didn't show the full picture, because there was another side to it, a quieter, simpler side, the side where meaning comes from small actions, from shared moments, from being present in the lives of others. I didn't know what the future would bring. I understood that there might come a time when I would need more help, when things would become harder, when decisions would have to be made again. And when that time came, I would face it, but not now. Now I still had something to give, and that was enough. I sat by the window one evening, watching the city lights slowly come alive, reflecting softly against the sky. People moved through the streets, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own lives. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel separate from it all. I felt like I was still part of it, not in the same way as before, but in a way that still mattered. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you never miss stories that remind us what truly matters in life.